Kia ora, ko Rachel Esson tōku ingoa, te Pouhuaki o te puna mataranga o Aotearoa. I'm Rachel Esson, National Librarian, and welcome to this panel discussion, which is the last bastion, libraries and community in times of crisis. And we are very fortunate today to have colleagues from the state libraries of Australia with us. So I would like to introduce John Vallance down the end there, who's the State Librarian in New South Wales, Vanessa, who is the State Librarian ACT, and Vicki, who is the State Librarian of Queensland. You had to have a V in your name to be selected for the panel. We have some questions to start with that I am going to ask the panel. So if you just excuse me one moment. All right, make sure that I've said everything that I need to say. The title of this presentation and the discussion is recognising the fact that as state libraries and national libraries, we've all lived through a number of challenges. Natural disasters of some sort or another, pandemics, all of those sorts of things. And so how have we responded? What have been the lessons? How have we been able to support our communities through those? So we thought that it's quite interesting to reflect on that and to learn from each other in terms of that. I mean, certainly I know when I came into the role of National Librarian, which was nearly 2 years ago. It was during the pandemic, but there was also this sort of sense of, oh, well, maybe we're nearly through it. No, we weren't. Not only did COVID keep on giving with different variants and so on, but then we had things like the anti-vaccine mandate protests, which saw us have protesters camping right around the library. All of the roads were blocked. And, you know, that was a couple of challenging weeks for all of the people, I think, of Aotearoa. And how we make sense of that is, you know, we're still going through that process. So today we've just got an hour. We're going to have sort of 40 minutes of pre-prepared questions, and then we'll throw it open to you. So start thinking about what you might like to ask. So, first question is for Vicki. Can you tell us about the combination of flood and pandemic in the State Library of Queensland in the last couple of years? How's the library been affected and how has the community responded? And I know you've also got some photos, so let me know and I can pop those up on the screen.
So thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everybody. Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. Well, I guess like everybody else, you know, we started this year off feeling a bit exhausted by COVID and wondering when it was all going to end. And in January, we'd actually had another lockdown. We'd had significant issues, I think, at the time around COVID testing, a lot and high peaks of COVID. So I remember in January lining up with a lot of other people for kilometres and kilometres to get tested, couldn't get a RATS test anywhere and those sorts of things. And then several weeks later, we were flooded. And I guess that was really it was totally unexpected to be flooded during COVID. And, you know, people were already feeling exhausted about those sort of circumstances. And the flood Flood is very different to COVID because in COVID it was an unusual circumstances in that our buildings were fine but we didn't have any staff, and then in the floods it was the exact opposite. Our staff were healthy at the time but we had no access to the building, and so it was the two very different circumstances. And I might just talk a little bit about the flood, if that's okay, because I think, you know, it's different to the COVID. And the flood was, it happened very quickly in Brisbane, and it was the 27th of February this year when the flood occurred. And Brisbane had 676 millimetres of rain between Friday and Sunday, which is, you know, it's a lot of rain. And we'd never before ever had more than 200 millimetres of rain in 2 consecutive days. So it gives you an idea of just the suddenness of it and the need to react very quickly. And I guess for us, we were very lucky that we'd just done a revision of our crisis management plan. But we hadn't expected that we would be enacting it within a month of having it finalised. So, we were very organised, but I guess in this occasion it did catch us by surprise, the severity of the flooding and just how quickly it occurred. So we've had to react very quickly and that sort of thing as well. So and when the floods occurred, we went into crisis. The whole site was declared a crisis, and we were locked out of our buildings, essentially. We could not go to the buildings. So there was lots of issues to deal with as well. So I think really it's the planning that has really been important as to how we could respond to the flood at that time. I've sort of lost the track of the question.
Well, it was just
Yeah.
how was it impacted, and here are the...
Yeah. So these are actually photos of COVID. So I think, one of the things we were going to talk about is just our role as a state library in documenting the different crises. So these are some photographs of COVID. So, and I guess, one of our roles is to document history for future generations. And it's hard to imagine that this is one of the main streets of Brisbane in peak time, and so you can see they're deserted. This photograph was taken by one of our photographers rather. If we just flick through some of those. So this is South Bank, which would normally be thousands of people on a summer's day, absolutely deserted. So Josie, one of our photographers, took this photograph here as well. Bare shelves in supermarkets, totally. I don't think I would have ever expected in my lifetime to ever go to a supermarket and not be able to buy what I wanted to buy. And so this picture here really shows, and it was probably the toilet roll aisle, I imagine. I don't know about New Zealand, but toilet roll was a hot item in Australia. You could not buy toilet roll at any time. So of course, there's lots of the swabbing samples here. So this is taken at one of the laboratories in Brisbane of the COVID testing. So this is Hamish Cairns, who is a commercial photographer. So we buy photo images from him. So that's part of the process as well. Is buying photographs from commission for photographers as well. And the jabs as well. And we also have a photograph, which I don't think is in this suite, is of the nasal swabs as well, which I think we have that memory as well. Yeah. The protests that you mentioned, Rachel, we also had protests in Australia in relation to the virus and anti-vaccinations, those sorts of things as well. Libraries abandoned, no clients. Bunnings warehouses, where the security guards took on the role of being the sanitisers, providing the sanitation as well. Children's playgrounds, not allowed to go to, closed to access. Zoom meetings, having the social drink, and I think I remember friends having drinks with friends around the world via Zoom. So here we are recording that as well. And so this is one of the big things that happened was drawing the parallels with the Spanish flu. And we have a photo in our collection that was taken at Red Hill, which is just not far from State Library. And it was picked up by newspapers and media around the world, and we consequently had millions of views of that particular image. But here's another one from the Spanish flu. And then I think there's the next photograph is actually the same bridge, which was part of the border closing. So Queensland, to protect its citizens, closed its borders and nobody could come into Queensland, so which was another big issue. A lot of protests around that as well, and you can see here the next photo there. After this one is again those police border patrols and stopping people coming into Queensland, but also stopping Queenslanders from going out as well. And this is the floods. So this is the floods from February, and you can see we're right on the Brisbane River, and the flooding came into the lower levels of our 2 buildings on the river. And as I said, it was different from the 2011 floods in that this time we did have a lot of rainfall, but most of our damage was done most quickly by the stormwater drains. And and there's just a couple more images, Rachel. So this is outside the library. There you would normally drive into the car park. So you can see there the amount of water that we had. And following the recovery, of course, there was a review of the whole process that was undertaken, and I had someone from one of the contractors groups who'd come to do it, and I was explaining to him around the devastation and the impact, and then I said, look, I think to really understand it most, you need to come down with me to the bottom level of the building. So I went down with him, and then I said, so it came into our bottom level 0 of our main building and also the level 0 of the edge. So I sort of stood down there in level 0 and I said, this is where the water came to. So it really was quite significant and dramatic in relation to the flooding that we had. So this is the Queensland Performing Arts Centre, which was flooded as well. So this would be the bottom of our building. You can see a lot of work to actually clean it out. There's a lot of measures that need to be taken to protect people. Our staff were not able to touch anything. It was all done by commercial contractors. A lot of regulations around ensuring safety as well. And that's down in our basement. And that's part of the team that came in on one weekend, the weekend of the flooding, to help us move trolleys very quickly out of our quarantine area as well. So I think that's all the images, yeah. But I think, one of the big things for us was actually the importance of having our crisis management plan in place and being able to respond, particularly in the case of the floods, to that emergency that happened within hours.
Gosh. Those photographs are really dramatic, and what a huge cleanup.
Well, it did. The flood actually happened on the 27th of April, and we reopened to the public on the 29th of April. But we only had, and what impacted us the most is that, like many buildings that were built in the 80s, our electrical work is in the basement. So, of course, that's what was flooded. So we lost all of our electricity and also our lifts. And you cannot buy lift parts in the eastern seaboard of Australia at the moment either. So we were able to reopen with one lift. And so we opened on the 29th of April, and that was because it was our birthday. It was our 120th birthday, and I thought we just cannot be closed on our birthday. So that was that really gave us the incentive to open as well.
Thanks, Vicki. And John, next question is for you. Can you tell us about New South Wales and what roles has the State Library played during Australia's Black Summer, the bushfires, for example?
The bushfires, we can run a whole suite of emergencies into one. You covered a couple at one. Thank heaven, just to get rid of the floods, first of all, at the State Library, we discovered some strategically well-placed holes in the roof. The State Library of New South Wales has been leaking for decades, and I think we've now plugged that up. But we had, thank heaven, nothing like you had to endure in that way. The bushfires, it's like the old Dorothea McKellar national poem of Australia about droughts and flooding rains. We've had everything, but Dorothea McKellar didn't say very much about bushfires. The last few years, we've seen the state pretty much scorched from top to bottom, right the way down to the border with Victoria. And in fact, it was, I think I was at a NSLA meeting in Hobart, where my wife rang me up to say that the bushfire brigade had just arrived at our house, and she was out there at 3 o'clock in the morning with firemen wondering why on earth I wasn't there to help. She was holding a hose, and we nearly lost our house. But the bushfires, I think, were the first opportunity for public libraries in particular across New South Wales to show just how important they were, and especially in the south of the state. They were They were sort of refuge centres. There was one library south of Sydney which ended up becoming a pet refuge centre. People were taking their domestic animals there for safekeeping. There were communication centres. A couple of public libraries were used by the Rural Fire Service. It was an emergency that I think I couldn't really have comprehended unless I'd actually had to seen some of the results of it myself at home. And I remember at the State Library Christmas party, there was this black apocalyptic sky, even in the centre of Sydney. It's something that's etched on all of our collective minds. There were libraries, of course, that were lost. One of the interesting things about Australia is that all the different states have different ways of relating their state libraries with the public library system. And in New South Wales, libraries are run by something I like to call my favourite piece of civic legislation, the Library Act of 1939. And it sets out the nature of the relations between the state library and public libraries. And so my colleagues at the State Library and Public Library Services were working very closely with the emergency services and public libraries in bushfire-affected areas, and then the same thing happened again with the floods. I don't know if you'd like me to say something about the floods. We've had 3 major floods in New South Wales over the last... and they're still going on now. There are still major floods in New South Wales. We even had the Broken Hill Library flooded. Now, Broken Hill's way out in the outback, and I have photos of the Broken Hill Library filled with water. But right the way from up near the Queensland border, libraries up in Lismore, that's the famous one that you will have seen photos of, pretty much destroyed by the recent floods, right the way down the coast and inland as well. And once again, public libraries have been providing emergency services in ways that very much relate to the nature of their own communities. And so during the flood emergencies, libraries have been providing emergency communications. They've been providing free document copying services. They've been providing free liaison with government agencies for the provision of emergency services. They've been helping affected people make insurance claims. A lot of very, very practical work that you wouldn't necessarily associate with the library. You'd say, well, that's something that another government agency might normally be responsible for. But the size and scale of New South Wales means that often there aren't those other resources available. And so my colleagues have been doing all sorts of things in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Up in northern New South Wales, there's been a big increase in homelessness as a result of the floods. And our libraries up around Tamworth have been reporting a big increase in the number of people who are living in cars and just parking their cars near the library, because that's the way they can stay in contact with people. And sometimes they're going and having showers in the library loos. I mean, it's really quite fundamental and basic, the nature of the emergency. And I don't think public libraries have ever really been called on to provide this range of support over so long. But there has been a bit of a silver lining to it, and that is that the New South Wales government only about 2 weeks ago announced the permanent continuation of an indexed dramatic increase in funding for public libraries that the State Library dispenses to them into the future, which means that from the next financial year we'll be giving almost exactly twice what we were able to give 5 years ago to public libraries. So in a sense, I think the government has realised that libraries are uniquely valuable resources, not just in times of peace and happiness, but in times of emergency.
Thanks, John. Thank you, and absolutely. I was pleased to be able to share with our Minister the other evening the increase in funding for public libraries through the State Library of New South Wales. And yeah, she was pleased to hear that. We know that she's also a really strong supporter of libraries in New Zealand and does recognise that breadth of support and service that public libraries in particular can play for their communities. So I think you're right, although there's all these terrible things happening, there is that silver lining. Thank you. Vanessa, Canberra has also had its share of things like fires, hail is something I think that Canberra has experienced, and I know that that's had an impact on the roof of the National Library of Australia. But can you tell us what ways you've seen public libraries in Canberra relied upon as public safe havens over the last few years? How have they risen to the challenge?
Yuma, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity of being able to talk about my home patch. Libraries in the ACT do fall within my remit, and we've always been, for quite some time, places of refuge, and so that means that when it's extremely hot, and they've got an index that the emergency services people apply, and I just get the phone call, and they say we're expecting period of extreme heat. So can you kick into gear? And so our public libraries become places of refuge during extreme heat, and people come and can stay, and we pay our staff overtime to keep the libraries open up until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, so that people can at least escape the heat for a period of time. So on that basis, during the fires of December 19 and January 20, we certainly became refuge places again. It was a very interesting time for me. Fantastic that the government sees us this way, and people come to us. They expect us to be places of refuge, and we did all sorts of things like programs, and we rolled out televisions and brought out all the beanbags we could find, and the emergency services people gave us lots of water and all those kinds of things. But the really interesting thing for me is that a number of my buildings are 50 or so years old, and so is the HVAC, the air conditioning. So I spent all of December and most of January 2020 on the telephone negotiating with people to keep the air conditioning going, because it kept breaking down. And we went through, I can't tell you how many pads we went through to keep the smoke out. It was unbelievable. And there is a young administrative assistant in one of our shared facilities, and I won't name them in case some of you know them, the college, but she probably has taken 5 or 10 years off of her life, because she tried to tell me that she wouldn't allow our air conditioning engineer into the utility room because I hadn't sent her an email. And so after I finished with her and then rang someone higher up in the organisation, she did let our air conditioning engineer in to our shared facilities so that the public could be there. So so we have a pretty well established kind of thing that happens when there's an emergency of that kind. But having said that, it was extremely interesting for me. I wasn't in Canberra in 2003 when the really big bushfires came. And my husband tells me of standing on the roof of his then house, trying to keep the house from burning down, which he did, which was great. But it sent this huge amount of fear amongst our members of the community, particularly the elderly and the vulnerable, because they so remember 2003, and it was in the fires of 2003 were actually in the residential areas of Canberra. So whilst the fires didn't make it to the residential areas this time, the smoke was horrendous, and it was weeks and weeks and weeks of smoke. I was told off absolutely afterwards, but too bad. We immediately got air testers into each of our library branches, and every morning we got onto to Teams and went, okay, today at Tuggeranong your air quality outside is going to be blah, so that means your air quality inside is going to be blah blah. Can you please make sure that you do this, this, this and this? And it gave the staff a sense of feeling a little bit more in control, because people were feeling really, really out of control, and it was just this, it never stopped, the smoke. And so I got told off roundly for doing that, by the way, because I did something that then they couldn't replicate in all of the other government agencies. But, sorry. But it certainly helped the staff. But it was a really tough time, and staff were just amazing in stepping up, doing the overtime, and creating things for people to do. Board games and all sorts of things were happening. Our COVID response was much like any of the other public libraries around the country, but I think the really fabulous thing for me was that our minister early on in COVID said, no, you're not closing. And I went, okay, Minister, how am I going to manage this? And he said, I don't mind about the books. You don't have to lend out books, but you must be open for the most vulnerable in the community to be able to access the internet, because the only way they're going to be able to tell people they're safe and all those sorts of things is via the internet. So in that first shutdown of Canberra, we were open for about 6 weeks, only open for that internet access. And to be honest, the only reason we stopped doing it was because we ended up with some pretty extreme issues of occupational violence, and I couldn't. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, I have responsibilities for the staff, and I couldn't run the risk. Otherwise, we probably would have stayed open for longer. So you had to make an appointment. You had to let us know you were coming. You could have half an hour. We had cleaners who basically cleaned up around you. There was a lot of use. We had a lot of use of those computers, and I got lovely emails from people about how wonderful it was we did it, and then some not very nice ones when we had to close it down. But of course, as you would expect, the vulnerable people coming in, they are heightened as well. We've just come off the fires. We've had the big storm where I think something like 300,000 cars in Canberra had to be scrapped. It was massive, We then had COVID, so these vulnerable people needed help with things like Centrelink and those sorts of things, and when they couldn't do what they wanted to do, then they got pretty angry, and that was a problem. Obviously, we did, as I said, all the stuff that other libraries did. We did online story time, and my plug, thanks for Alia for being able to get us copyright-free access to picture books for that period, because that enabled us to do it without getting sued, which was pretty helpful. And the feedback we got from the community was they really loved the fact that their kids could sit and watch online story time and still see the same people who did it at the library. So it was they had that connection of, there's the staff member that I normally, talk to and show my books to. So that was really great. We also identified that there were a lot of families who were quite vulnerable that didn't have books in the house. Happened to be towards the end of the financial year when maybe some of my colleagues in other parts of the directorate hadn't spent all their money. We're always ready in April for that. And so we went out and bought a whole lot of books, and also thank you to the National Library who gave us some as well. And we partnered with all of the organisations that were still going out into the community. So we didn't send our staff out to that, but we found all of those organisations like Salvos and those, and they took them out to those families. And then there was books in people's houses. We also had a project that we started with housing. So our government obviously has housing for vulnerable people. We pop books in their boots of the managers, the housing managers who go around and inspect the houses and talk to the tenants and that kind of thing. So we did that. Our Community Services Directorate also prepared like a little bag for families to try and keep them amused during shutdown, and we contributed material to that as well. And then when there was a partial open up, we delivered those as well. And as an outcome of all of that now, the Health Directorate came to us probably about 3 or 4 months ago now. They were continuing the program that the Commonwealth finished, where people on concession cards were getting free rat tests. You're not supposed to say that, are you? You're supposed to say rats, because you're doing tests twice. So because the Commonwealth had stopped that program, the ACT government had decided to keep it going for people on concession cards, but they needed a distribution point that wasn't health services because the health services were being hammered. So our libraries, after a considerable discussion with our staff and the union, our libraries are now the pick-up point for concession card holders for their RATs. And we've just been approached by the Community Services Directorate, who also provide free RATs to some of the people who work in that disability support sector. And so we're just about to start handing those out as well. So for us, it means we're doing our bit in the community, and that's great, and it's bringing new audiences and people into the library. But for me, being approached by those other directorates was really great, because they, some years ago they wouldn't have even known that we could have done anything like this, but working our way through the fires and all those sorts of things, they've triggered that we can be part of the solution.
Thank you. I think some good illustrations there of that saying about never let a good crisis go to waste. One of the things that just occurs to me through all of these stories that you've shared has been the impact on staff, on yourselves as well as on staff. How have you kept your people resilient, or what are some of the things that you've put in place to support your staff and help them? Vicki, do you want to start?
Well, I think you're right. I think the issue is with a lot of these crises, you're dealing with it in the workplace as well as in the home. And, particularly in the floods, we also have staff whose homes were flooded. They've lost their homes as well as what we're dealing with at work. So I guess you really do focus on them being able to focus on their own home life and just say, just forget about us, focus on what you do and provide whatever support you can. But I think also, one of the big things that's come from COVID is just the change in working arrangements. There's a lot more focus on working remotely, being more flexible in working arrangements, and I think that, I think we've all agreed that will continue to happen. But we also have all the usual mechanisms that have, emerged, particularly during COVID, is the check-in sessions on Zoom every morning, people checking in, the morning teas on Zoom, all of, making sure that people have those connections, can check in with people as well. And I'm sure it's happened in everyone else's libraries similarly. But, people are very resilient, but people also are very keen to look after each other as well. And they actually emerge with the solutions themselves in dealing with the different circumstances that have come up. And that happened very quickly with COVID, is that, staff identified we need to look after each other, and, different mechanisms for doing that emerged quite quickly. I don't know whether the same thing happened in your library, John, or...
Yeah, no, it did indeed. And as Vicki suggested, it's not just a matter of our staff providing services for the public, but I mean they're directly affected themselves. And I was very proud at the State Library back in June 2020. I think we were one of the very first government agencies to reopen, and I was very chuffed about that. But it was our reading room staff who had to bear the brunt of that, our cleaning staff, our security staff, and a lot of those people were extraordinarily anxious about being some of the very first people to start venturing out in public again. And although we'd put up various sort of prophylactic screens and desks and so on, they had no idea what was going to happen to their own health. And then we had more lockdowns, openings, more lockdowns, openings. And a lot of my colleagues live on their own. Some of them live on their own in quite small flats. So they've been subject to great pressure at home, being isolated, and then they come to work and they're under pressure because, again, they don't know what risks they're facing. In Sydney, the whole vaccination thing caused, I think, just as much distress as I was hearing last night it was causing here in New Zealand. We just had the results of our annual staff survey a few weeks ago, and it's made it very clear that people are pretty much over it. My colleagues are just worn out. They're completely fed up. And against this, and it's nothing to do with library policy, but we're going through an international period of economic upheaval. Interest rates are going through the roof. People's mortgages are going up. Electricity prices are going up. Salaries aren't going up. So you've got inflation 7-8%. You've got salaries rising almost no. So I think our colleagues collectively are under a huge amount of pressure at the moment, as is everybody, of course. But I think it's exacerbated when you're having to be in the front line offering services to the public. And so I'd be glib if I said it's all hunky-dory at the moment. And I think we've got quite a bit of work on our hands to try and rebuild morale. And I suspect that's going to be the case across all our institutions.
I think too, for us, just, we're also at the moment preparing for anticipating another flood in the next 2 months. You've all heard the weather forecasts that are, forecast for the next few months. So we know that means more rain. And it's likely that we'll have another flood. So it's really, that is also very taxing as well. But you have to focus on being prepared and I guess being ready for that sort of circumstance as well. And I think it is very draining, the fact that COVID is still continuing. Back in 2020, I thought this was going to be wrapped up by June. And we'll just continue on. But 3 years later, it's still there. So it's having to adjust and refresh when you can. And I think one of the things we really had to do during COVID is, and still need to do, is when people are sick, just say, don't work. And I think that's been one of the outcomes from when they're working from home, is people feel that they're obligated to keep working even when they are sick. But we really need to keep saying, if you're sick, stop working and take care of yourself.
And in addition to that, from what Vicki's been saying, the please don't come into work, please don't work thing has resulted in something that I never thought I would do in 44 years in libraries, and that is closing libraries. Our staff are taking no more instances of sick leave, but when they take their sick leave, they're not taking 1 day anymore, they're taking 3. And that has, along with a few other things that have happened within the ACT industrially, has resulted in us closing libraries. In fact, I think we celebrated the week before last because we went through the whole week without closing one. But from July, we've been closing libraries consistently. That's, always look for the silver lining. It has put us on the radar of government. So, that's a good thing, but it's broken people's hearts, and it's exacerbated how people have felt, depressed and over it. But they also too have given us a really clear message in our staff survey, and that again, we're looking for the positives. Has been an enabler for us to be able to start looking at conditions and those sorts of things. It's really exacerbated the have and the have-nots. I don't know whether anyone else has got the same experience, but because we work within a directorate that is loosely like your local councils, so we have roads and rubbish and all those things in our directorate, and we have a lot of policy people and things like that. So our library staff see all of those lucky people and they call our office, not necessarily just us, but our office, they call it the Ruby Princess, which the Australians will understand, which is the first of those big ships that had a lot of COVID on it. Yeah. They think it's unfair that the people in the centre and in the other parts of the directorate can work from home and they can't. So it's a really big issue that we're having to deal with. What can we offer our staff to sort of compensate for that feeling of being second-class citizens?
Thank you. Sobering. And I think, the clear message is that, we do need, as leaders, to model that looking after yourself, but also, we've got the levers to sort of say, we will close libraries if we need to, or we will build backlogs, or, we're able to be the ones that deliver that message to actually keep our staff safe, because, we can't do the work that we do without them. And as we've heard, people have been through a lot. The other thing that occurs to me just before I throw it open to questions is, the other thing that we've heard is that climate change impact is here to stay. Vicki, you're planning for more floods. What is it that we as libraries can do? I think we've been talking about, just things like reducing travel to reduce the emissions that we're responsible for, but also how we store our collections in the future. Digitisation, do we have such an ambitious program for that, given impacts on energy use of digital storage, things like that? What is it? What's the role that you see that state libraries in particular can have? Who would like to start with that one? Not one that you prepared for. Sorry.
Well, we've just done our I'll just jump in quickly and someone else could continue. We've just done our strategic planning, and that actually came up in the staff discussions, is they really want to ensure that we have some measures and strategies around things that we're going to do around sustainability, and that we're actually focused on measuring it and measuring the impact that we have, and how we reduce some of what you've talked about, Rachel, some of the use of electricity, but also how we're looking for more efficient ways to do things. And so I guess there is a focus on that, and that, the staff are driving that. As an organisation, we need to be socially responsible and do the same things as well. And I guess we're also, one thing that I'm really keen on is, more focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think as developing countries, we don't put as much focus on it as other countries, particularly the developing countries. So I think that is something that, as institutions where people go for information, that is something that we could actually put a lot more effort into, is increasing the awareness of our roles in achieving those SDGs as well.
I guess from our point of view, because, why else wouldn't you? We tried to do a massive community co-design for the future of our library service in the middle of COVID. So we'd started it and then had to stop and start and all that sort of stuff. So this was a co-design that was extremely broad across the community. So we've got nearly 500,000 people in Canberra now, 485 or something. So it was very broad across the community, but also very deep. So it went for 2 years, and we very much wanted to explore what people thought their lives were going to be like in 2030 and how the library might match to those needs and desires. The sustainability issue came up very, very strongly, and it's something that we're going to have to apply our minds to more than just putting solar on the roof and trying to cut down on a courier. Our community is saying very, very strongly to us that they want us to be leaders in that area, not followers. So watch this space from the ACT's point of view.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We've only quite recently added climate risk, the risk of climate change effects, formally onto our risk register, and so our audit and risk committee is now considering these issues regularly. And for us, there are two aspects. First of all, there's the sort of social responsibility, public aspect, and we're doing what other institutions are doing to make our operation more efficient, reduce energy consumption, reduce waste, find new ways of chucking stuff out or not chucking stuff out, as it may be. But we also face an acute risk that's posed by climate change. We talked a bit about bushfires earlier, but like Vicki, we are subject to flood. The old buildings on Macquarie Street weren't built for the sort of monsoonal downpours that we have at the moment, so we're having to rebuild guttering and flood mitigation systems at the State Library itself. But also, about 50% of our collection is stored in a rented warehouse on the banks of the Georges River out at Liverpool. And every time there's a monsoonal downpour, my colleague Phil Barter and I are up all night watching the flood gauge as it gets. Is it going to reach the banks? Is it going to break the banks? We have to ring the people and ask to put the flood barriers up. So we're now urgently looking at another place to keep 50% of our collection. Closer to the library. So, I mean, I think this is going to be a story to be replicated across both our countries, that the risks posed by climate change are going to change very fundamentally the way we do almost everything. And we're really being tested publicly, privately, personally at the moment, and I think future generations will judge us on how well we reacted to these challenges.
Thank you. There's now an opportunity for you to ask questions, so both online and in the auditorium here. Does anyone have any questions? And while we're waiting for people to formulate their thoughts, I'm just wondering whether, and Vicki, perhaps you could start with this question. In the course of the work that you're talking about in terms of how libraries respond to issues, has there been any change in the way that your libraries have worked with First Nations communities? Has that changed anything?
I guess in the context of today's discussion, First Nations communities were very impacted by COVID. As communities, they had different restrictions to the rest of the community. We have the Biosecurity Act, which actually enforced that people were not able to go to communities. So that meant that for quite a period of time, our staff were unable to go there to deliver services, but also to exchange books and things like that. So, and we were also very aware, once the restrictions had been lifted, that when our staff go there, we really need to be very aware that we didn't want to be taking COVID to these vulnerable communities as well. So we would do a lot of pre-testing before staff went. We'd sign different forms and things like that, and we would need to get permission as well to go to those communities. Not every community was willing to have people to come in, but also during COVID, particularly during the lockdowns. A lot of the schools were closed, so students who from the remote communities who were in boarding schools in Brisbane went home, but then they needed to have access to collections and to internet and Wi-Fi and e-resources and things like that. So particularly the Indigenous knowledge centres in those communities were opened up to those students so that they could actually conduct some of their classes, have access to e-resources and things like that. For many of them, it was their first time that they actually were using their IKCs to access some of these e-resources and things like that. So we certainly work with them in those circumstances, and some of the IKCs were turned into temporary classrooms and things like that. But we also, in COVID, when we were locked in our homes, we also became more dependent upon internet and the access to those resources. And in some of our communities, Indigenous communities, they don't have a lot of access to internet, or it's very expensive. So we worked through the IKCs to provide that access, but also through our other programs, rolled out different grants and things like that to enable the communities to increase their the access to internet and programs and things like that as well. So we worked on lots of different levels with the different communities. And remembering in Queensland, these communities are quite remote. So to get to one of these communities, it's like from Brisbane, 2.5 hour flight to Cairns, and then maybe another couple of hours to one of the communities. So we're talking big distances as well. So they can be quite isolated as well to the rest of the community.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Yeah, what exactly are we talking about in terms of COVID and the emergencies, or more generally?
More generally, yeah.
About this is an area where I've learnt most. In fact, over the last 2 days here in Wellington, I've learnt an immense amount about this. I'm a little bit uncomfortable talking about the work we do with First Nations people without my First Nations colleagues here. That's one of the first lessons that I've learned, that a lot of our thinking is just based on the model of a Western collecting institution, if we're talking about library terms. And what I'm learning from my Indigenous colleagues at the State Library of New South Wales is that collecting in the First Nations context doesn't look like the collecting that we've been doing traditionally. And so I'm taking a step back and watching things develop. And so there's a lot of really fascinating work being done in regional communities in New South Wales, particularly in oral history. And I know that the same thing's happening here. We've been learning about that in the Maori context over the last 2 days. And the other thing that we're getting more and more involved with is in the context of prisons in New South Wales. It's one of the greatest international scandals, and although I love my homeland dearly, I'm deeply ashamed when I think of it. The fact that, first of all, at the moment, as a percentage of the population of New South Wales, there are probably more people in jail now than there have been at any point in our modern European history, but between 30 and 40% of those people are Aboriginal. And so my colleagues are starting to work on family history programs for Aboriginal inmates in prisons in New South Wales, which is offering them maybe one tiny ray of hope that will allow them to connect to the kind of traditions, past history, culture that I might go to a library and find in a book, but our ignorance has blinded us to finding solutions until relatively recently. I'm hoping that things are going to start moving there fairly quickly, but my golly gosh, there's a long way to go.
And from our point of view, the COVID lockdown definitely meant that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities locked down even harder because they were very frightened of the health impacts of COVID. Something that happened that was just a little serendipity and that was fantastic for us was that the NAIDOC, one of the NAIDOC events was planned to be out in the plaza in front of one of our libraries, and it poured with rain, and their contingency was to come into the library. So we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families poured into the library. I haven't quite told the COVID people, and for the first time, many of them walking around going, "Oh my God!" Like, "Oh God, DVDs!" And we'd just opened our recording studio and our podcasting studio, so that was very popular, which was great. So we want to build on that now that we've got people who have come into us for the first time. They've taken that step on the basis that they really wanted to just celebrate NAIDOC, but they've taken the first step in, so we've now got a bit of an in. The other thing that we're doing at the moment, we have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander coordinator, and he's been working very hard on relationship building for us, because the feedback we get, of course, is that we are colonial, formal institutions that people don't want to walk through the door of. So he's been doing a lot of relationship building, and he and a couple of the other Indigenous people within our directorate came up with this idea that, our library is very white construct, and that their library is the land. So we've now got a program called Library of the Land, which if you go onto our website, I think you can see the first one. And we're interviewing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from around Canberra about their lives and their experience, and each person has a particular expertise. So I think the first one that's up is one of our Indigenous land managers. So he's a ranger, and he's talking about fire management and land management through fire. So, so we're trying to not do the, let's write this all down, but do this orally and visually and celebrate what they do.
Thank you.
May I throw in one little thing,
Sure.
an addendum very quickly? There's some interesting work being done at the moment in New South Wales about a third group of narratives, which perhaps we're not in Sydney doing enough about. We're talking about First Nations narratives. We've been talking about colonial narratives for a very long time. But there are also the narratives of all the migrant communities in Sydney, all the non-English speaking communities. And we're starting to recognise that we serve them very, very poorly. They're huge Indian communities, they're Chinese communities, they're Arabic communities and so on. And so we're collecting not just modern work to satisfy their needs and interests, but we're just about to launch a program to buy rare, valuable, out-of-print works from the early Chinese tradition, the Indian tradition, the Arabic tradition, so that people from the whole wave of our communities in Sydney can come in and find their cultures represented in their own library.
Thank you. We do have a couple of comments online. So for those in the audience here, I can share those. We have a comment from Paul Duller, who is the State Librarian from Victoria and wasn't able to be with us for the NSLA meeting, which he says he's very sorry he couldn't be there in person. But he says, thanks for the panel session. You've coped so well with so much crisis. Post-lockdown at the State Library of Victoria, we've been busier than ever. And I wonder if this is because that all we offer is uniquely attractive in the CBDs and that otherwise we're struggling with an identity crisis. Shared, free, creative spaces for finding and doing things to better yourself. What's your response to that comment? You think is that something that resonates?
I guess, we're just looking at our latest stats for the first quarter of this financial year, and we can see that we're already on track to reach or exceed our pre-COVID numbers. And I think we've talked a lot about the impact and the negative things that happen from COVID, but I think also there's been some positive outcomes that have come from COVID as well. It's actually, we've put a lot more focus on our online delivery and really focusing on how we actually share our collections but also engage with people much more. And I think that is really having a very positive impact on people coming to the library online, but also similarly on site as well. There is, like Paul suggested, it's a safe place to come, but it's also a place where you can come to enjoy a range of activities, being with other people or being by yourself. Everyone takes something different from their library visit, but I think certainly I see that we're going from strength to strength in relation to how we're actually engaging with the community, but also building our relationships with community as well, and certainly will exceed where we were before COVID as well.
Thank you.
We're not finding people are coming back in person as much as previously, but where they are coming back is where they want to be part of a program or an activity. So there was a lot of pent-up demand when we reopened to start our programming again. The Canberra community are borrowing, but they're doing that online. So my online loans are almost the same as my in-person loans. In fact, I think another few months and they'll tip. But people still want to come to the library, but they want to come for different reasons now. So we still do have a group of people who are quite careful about coming into the library, and we still provide the service that we started during COVID, which we call Mystery Box. You get 10 items delivered to your door based on your particular genre. And we have so many people using that service that we are probably not going to be able to stop it, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to be able to staff it, because during COVID our government ran a program where you were asked as public servants, do you have any projects in your bottom drawer that you've always wanted to do but you've never had the staff to do? And it's like, yeah. Yes, okay, well, we'll fund the staff for you. So Mystery Box was one of those projects. So we're finding that people are not coming and browsing as much as they used to, but they are coming for other purposes, but they are still using the library electronically. So I think it depends on your demographic, to be honest.
Yeah, it's very interesting. When I started as State Librarian in late 2017, there was a sense that the New South Wales government wanted us to start, there's this hideous phrase, and I apologise in advance for using it, monetising our spaces. If anyone ever says that to me, I might do something violent, monetise our spaces. And so the idea was that we were going to use our heritage spaces to rent them out for company AGMs and all sorts of things like this, weddings and so on. And we'd make the money that we needed to top up what was required for our operations. And fortunately, although we've got a brilliant venue hire team at the library who does a great job, they do a great job, we're not under that pressure anymore. I think the government has now understood what a library is, and the benefits it offers the community are so strong that we shouldn't be expected to have the Westpac AGM in the reading room just to raise a few extra bob, thank God. And so, the future is ours, and we're using the post-COVID period is an opportunity really to reinvent ourselves. It's going to be a bit of a climb back to get to our pre-COVID levels of visits. Just before COVID hit in 2020, we were up almost to 4,000 visitors a day, which I think was a historic record. Although I should say that there are some public library areas in the west of Sydney that will see that anyway. I mean, that's no big deal. And that's another point in favour of public libraries. But the State Library of New South Wales is a building site at the moment. We're currently building an underground auditorium. We have all sorts of mess all over the place. But we're hoping that in the new year, we've got a way clear to having 1 million visitors in 2023, which would be a record. I don't really mind what people do when they come there, as long as it's not for the Westpac AGM. It's got to be for a sort of proper... Or illegal, yeah, that's my bottom line as well, Vanessa, thank you. And it's interesting at the moment, it's giving us an opportunity just to reimagine what a library is for, what it should be doing, how far we should just be, as Marie-Louise was saying this morning, just have collections and allow people to come and make sense of them as they will, or guide them towards particular understandings of certain areas of the collections. In fact, there's probably no reason why we can't do a bit of everything, and I think that's probably where we're headed.
Thank you. There's a really lovely comment online that I'd like to share with the audience here. As an Aboriginal librarian, I've found new insights due to the climate problems into using new technology to provide new direction of client services to remote locations, and it's required me to be more active in gaining knowledge of the library Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections, which has been exciting and adventurous, and one which will hopefully continue for me in the finer weather. Isn't that lovely? There was also a question about, do you feel that your contributions have been recognised by the government, for example, through increased funding? And I think we've touched on that a bit. But the follow-up question is, you know, what are the strategies to continue to kind of make the most of the opportunities, and how do you keep that adventurous and exciting journey? Any last thoughts? Because I know we're just about at time. Oh, we are at time, sorry.
Sorry, okay.
Maybe it will have to hang in the air. Were there any burning questions in the audience here? Because I know you haven't had a chance. Barb?
I was just going to ask, it's just tricky to be quick, but sorry. I'm aware that in the course of experiencing disaster, your libraries have also had to collect it, and I was wondering what that looked like, or perhaps one or two examples of what that looked like.
Well, I think I've shown you some of my examples. So, you know, certainly the photographing and the photographs, but also oral histories, digital stories. I know that we did a digital story with someone who was in hospital with COVID, and because I think so quickly we forget things, so we actively thought about how we're going to document these significant periods in Queensland's history for future generations. So lots of thinking happening around that, yeah.
We did lots of the crowdsourcing. So, you know, please take a photograph of your Anzac Day standing at your front gate with your candle kind of things. And I did contribute. I did photographs of all of the different things I baked and the book I was reading at the time I baked it. So the staff thought that was quite funny. But the funniest thing is that like you, we and Marie-Louise had much more of a difficult time with this. But we had that anti-vaxxer big groups of people turn up to protest in Canberra, and they started out parking around poor old Marie-Louise's library, but ended up at our showgrounds in Canberra, which is run by the ACT government. And so when they left, when they were invited to go by the federal police, we somehow had connection to the cleaner. And I think he might be a mate of our heritage librarians, and she must have rung him up. And so we've got all of these things that they left as they left the building, or left the centre. So, so we've got some really interesting pieces of memorabilia now from the anti-vaxxer point of view, which we know people are going to object to, but, you know, it's there because it's part of history, but all came from the cleaner. So it was pretty cool.
Very, very quickly, because I know you want to escape. One of the best things that happened at my place at the beginning of COVID, a group of my colleagues put on a really brilliant little exhibition about the Spanish flu epidemic and how New South Wales reacted then. And I didn't know that we had in our collection all these little things, like permits to leave and enter New South Wales country towns. A police permit that allowed you to go into Lismore for one day. You had to sign out of Lismore when you left. I had no idea. And it shows that however grand your library is, do not be snooty about collecting ephemera. You'll often find that the ephemera turns out to be the most important stuff that you have. And I can assure you that we've been hoovering it up pretty systematically.
Thank you. And that's certainly been the experience here in New Zealand as well, both signs left from protesters, but also things like the stickers on the back of the bus seats that said, you know, don't sit here, and all of those sorts of things. So please join me in thanking our panel. It's been fascinating, if at times a little depressing. Turned off. If at times a little depressing. However, I'm going to go away focusing on the silver linings. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking them.